Hey everyone. Okay, so this is the recording version. I'm going to go ahead and let y'all know we previously did this one. So I'm going to fill in what was mentioned by those who participated in the event earlier this evening. So please bear with me as I get our screen shared and as you deal with the recording as opposed to the live version. I appreciate you very much. Also going to blur that just because nobody needs to see. Um, okay, everyone. So again, thanks so much for joining. We're going to be talking today about acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. And as I mentioned, this was previously recorded, so you're getting the abridged version or the version afterwards. But I'm going to do my best to include all of the comments and try to follow along from the transcript that was from the live version for everyone. So, our learning objectives for today. Oh, and I apologize. If you aren't familiar with me, my name is Meg Solomon, and I am the owner and executive director of ABA Across Environments in Colorado Springs. And I love ACT. I've been doing ACT for about 5 years now, and it's one of my passions. It's something that I practice in my own life as best as I possibly can. And we'll talk about more about what that looks like as well, because it's a practice, right? As well as with our learners. So today, our learning objectives are to go over what is ACT, what is this idea? Where do we start? What are the basic applications of ACT? And how does this help our learners? What does some of the research say? But most importantly, we're also going to walk away with some ways to collect data, in particular about with how to score these types of behavioral responses with what we see. So this psychological flexibility is the key principle of ACT. It is essentially this idea that there is not mastery, right? So a lot of us, and this is again from our live version, we had a lot of teachers who were in the audience, and we talked a lot about direct instruction, right? So when we think about our instructional design, and when we think about instructional design, we think about our scope and our sequence. Where do we want this to go? What are the behaviors that we need to do, that we need to teach to get us there? What are the skills that we need to teach to get us there, right? However, when we think about psychological flexibility, it's in its word, right? Like the flexibility itself, we can't necessarily say this target has been mastered and now we can move on to the next one, because there is no true mastery whenever we think about acceptance and commitment therapy. It's our values, and our values help guide us, but there is no endpoint other than death for where our values are supposed to be guiding us. So instead of looking at it like as from a scope and sequence lens, I really want us to think about it as I really want us to think about ACT as a framework or a flow chart. We're all very familiar with flow charts. This is another thing that I want us to think about too, just because we're thinking about choices. So when we look at this flow chart model, when within the framework of acceptance and commitment therapy, a, something happens, a choice is made. This choice is going to get this response, and that choice is going to get another response. Okay. So this is how I want us to think about ACT. It's a flow chart. It's a decision-making processing tool. So this is why it can be slightly more difficult for behavior analysts to really program for, because they're like, wait, what do you mean? It's got to be contextual. It does. Every little bit of the context is going to matter and going to determine then what your next response or stimulus or prompt is going to be, essentially. Okay, so one of my biggest things is we can't do ACT. We can't tell somebody else to do ACT. We can't have somebody else do ACT. We're going to have to practice ACT ourselves. So I'm going to invite everybody to turn off their camera. I mean, actually, you don't have to because this is recording. Just kidding. I invited everybody to turn off their camera earlier. So, but right now, you don't have to do anything other than just take a moment. Let out that stale air. I'm going to close my eyes because that's what I'm going to invite everybody else to do as well. So go ahead, close your eyes. Now we're going to take in a deep breath to the count of 3 and let it out to the count of 5. So in, out. We're going to do it 2 more times. Out. One more. In, out. Now just notice where you are with your body, keeping your eyes closed. Notice what your eyebrows might be doing, your jaw. Notice what your shoulders might be doing. Notice what your hips, your legs, and your feet and your hands might be doing. Now open your eyes and bring that awareness outward. What can you observe that's in front of you or around you? What can you hear? What can you smell? I was going to say taste. I did earlier, but it was really just coffee breath. So just be mindful about that one. You can elect not to observe some things as well. So this should bring you a little bit more into where we are right now, our current context of learning. Notice if you are slightly more ready, slightly more HRE, as we would say. Beautiful. So this is how we practice ACT. And we can practice this on a daily basis by just building upon this exercise or another exercise that we're going to do later on in our series or in our webinar today. So this is the act of being in the present moment. When might this be important? It might be really important to engage in this behavior before you enter a classroom, an ABA session, a conflict, a challenge, the day, ending your lunch break, leaving your car and entering your home. There isn't a moment that's best to practice this, or at least I can't tell you the best time to practice this, but practice it. And then you'll find yourself practicing it more often when you need. And that's honestly the idea, right? Behind practicing coping skills, but also practicing ACT. There are going to be days that you're going to lose your mind. You're going to yell. You're going to have emotional responses. You're going to engage in behaviors that do not align with your values. But if you can come back to just this little exercise, that's getting back into the practice of ACT. And so these exercises are so important for us as compassionate caregivers and providers so that we can do more than just say that we're compassionate, but we're practicing self-compassion, which in return is going to be a skill that's modeled, right, for our learners. And this is something that we talked about in the live version, which was how do we introduce this to teenagers and adolescents? How do we get their buy-in to do these exercises? Well, it's going to start with you. It's going to start with you being able to model these exercises. And we're going to talk more about some examples here in just a second, too, about how we can, again, get that quote unquote buy-in, right? But that was great practicing. Way to go. You did more than what most people have done today. Okay, read through this quote by Dr. Hayes. He's the one who said this is a practice. You're going to fall off. You just have to commit to getting back on. And so when we were in this live recording, this is the experiential metaphor that we were really talking about a lot because I feel like we all hear this. This is for those of you who aren't aware, the time of this recording, it's December 17th. So we're at the end of the year. It's a very busy time, a very hectic time of the year. As I said, many of the people who were attending live are educators. And we all talked about how much we're drowning or treading water. One of them said, I've got a straw going above the water, but I was like, you might have your lungs full of water, right? Like some of us are like breathing in some water. Some others of us have like we're like full on, like we need somebody to pull us out. So if you're feeling those feelings, you're not alone, right? So that's an inner behavior that we all experience. We're going to talk a little bit more about inner behavior here in a second, but that's something that we're all experiencing on a regular basis, right? And so the idea of ACT is that you ride the wave when these types of challenges happen, right? So when we look at this, like it's not teaching them to power through, right? We're not trying to swim through the ocean's current and fight the ocean's current, but we're trying to ride that wave, ride the current that's there, that's been given to us. But again, how do you do that if you're treading water or drowning? Well, you're going to have to do what we just did. You're going to have to stop. You're going to have to find that stillness. That's what the present moment does for us, is find a little bit of stillness so that we can realign where we are, reorient ourselves with the current context. Okay, well, why am I feeling like I'm drowning? What all's going on? Label it. Label it yourself. Write it down. Write down every single one of the stressors that you have going on currently in your life. Find that common feeling that you're having. Somebody said jealousy earlier. Another person said sadness. I said anger. Some people say frustration. So, those feelings that we have, that inner behavior, is something that's a shared experience. And Brown and Kubina wrote an article in 2022, and you have access to it. It's where you access this recording, is where you were able to access those articles as well. But Brown and Kubina um, discussed how, when we have these negative thought patterns, these negative thoughts arise, how we can do timings of positive statements. And y'all, that's so in alignment with ACT because we just talked about these inner behaviors that we have: envy, jealousy, anger, sadness. We all have these feelings. Several of us talked about how we were drowning. We literally used that same metaphor of like, I am barely treading water. Well, if we're riding the wave, we can't. You're not riding anything, you're just treading. So reorient yourself, just as we did before, get acclimated. Why are you in the ocean? Right? That's what's going to get you through. Okay. Why am I in this to begin with? Why am I in this situation? Okay. Now I know. And now I also know that that feeling that I was having of jealousy, anger, sadness was actually pinpointing to the fact that there's a misalignment with my value of whatever, this thing that I care deeply about, and what's currently going on in my environment. Okay, that's why I feel like I'm drowning. Now I need to find my surfboard and I need to get there and I need to make this committed action to get back on the board so I can ride the wave. That's why it's a practice. That's why if all you do is practice breathing and realigning your thoughts and your body with the world around you, that's fantastic. Okay? Because you're then not drowning. And that's really, really important. Okay, we're going to talk more about inner behavior here in a second too. So, but before we do, we're going to get into the basics, just as we were talking about. First learning objective. What is ACT? Acceptance and commitment therapy. Okay, so this is actually, it's been around since the 80s. Dr. Hayes, Dr. Stephen C. Hayes originally coined this, and it is rooted in relational frame theory. So, relational frame theory doesn't discount verbal behavior, but it also recognizes that when we have like this initial thing that's taught, we can build upon the frame so that this stimulus and has the same, or it can have a different meaning for this and this, right? Or it can also have the same. One of the examples that Dr. Hayes gives is just to give something a name. We have nicknames all the time, right? That's an example of relational frame theory. We also build ideas of what things are supposed to be in our minds. That's also relational frame theory. we engage in imaginative play and role play and idea thinking and creative writing. That's relational frame theory. You're taking one idea and you're building upon it. It's the same thing for ACT, just as we were talking about before. So the framework, right? The flow chart, that is relational frame theory. So as we have like this one thing that's happening, we're going to build upon this idea so that it gives us some other work to deal with or to give tools for, essentially. So when we think about contexts, we're going to think, let's talk about the learning context in particular. What are some things that might be established within just a learning context? Well, worksheets, right? Materials like paper and pencils and markers, whiteboards, teachers, these are all stimuli that are within the learning environment. Those help build that frame for the educational setting, just as it does with our learners. So you have to be aware of what you're adding to that context and what you're taking away from that context as a practitioner. Cool. If you have any questions about any of these concepts, please feel free to email me at the end of this and as you're taking notes, and I'm happy to answer any questions as well as just schedule some time with you too, because I know it can be a lot. So we're going to talk a little bit about the pillars of ACT, but the biggest thing to recognize is that there are going to be pieces that are about, okay, I've got to accept this as a challenge that's going on in my life, and I've got to commit to making a values-based behavior change. Excuse me. So, what I like to talk about first is the why, right? So, why are you in the ocean? Why are you in the ocean? Why are you treading water right now? It was a choice. It's a choice to tread water, right? So, it's a choice to be in that ocean. Why did you originally get in? Think about that. Not why are you still in it? Because for right now, for some of us, it could just be the paycheck. But for others, it could be, okay, I got into this field of ABA because I genuinely wanted to help others. And I also recognize like there's that saviorism component, but that's also why I wanted to change that behavior as well, because I wanted to compassionately and genuinely and authentically help people as opposed to just performatively help people, right? There's that difference in value. But that's one of my number one values. That's why I'm in the ocean. I'm also in it because I truly value my family and being able to provide for my family, right? So there's that money tangible component. But I also value honesty. And I find this work to be incredibly honest. You have an observational component that's honest, right? That's often where I find my anger arise, right? So like that feeling of anger usually signals that something's dishonest or someone's been dishonest. And then I have to practice these skills that we're going through right now to help me recognize like, oh, I'm angry right now because my core value of honesty has has some conflict, right? So then I have to recognize that there's action that has to be in alignment. There's behavior that has to be in alignment with action or with the values, excuse me. So that's called committed action. This is going to depend on the context. So what I'm thinking of that context of like, ooh, somebody was just dishonest to me. Am I going to get revenge? That's a choice I could make. Am I going to lie to them? Am I going to make their lives a living hell? Probably not. It's not within my values. But because honesty is, I'm going to speak my truth. I might just deliver the information that I have. The audience can make their determination from there. I don't have to say anything more than just delivering what I know, right? That's how I can act in alignment with my values, behave in alignment with my values. These are things that we have to model for our learners, right? And some ways that we can do this is how we program. Are we doing what we say we're going to do? This is one of the reasons why I love skills-based treatment or SBT, because we're honoring happy, relaxed, and engaged, right? Just as we were doing before when we were regulating ourselves. But we also are then honoring that communication, that committed action of, okay, Thanks. Not right now, dude. Oh, okay. Hey, great job saying okay. I'm building this trust in our relationship, right? I'm doing what I say that I'm going to do within this learning context, and that's how I'm building that frame. That's how I'm building the educational context is by establishing trust. And that's a committed action. And I'm modeling that for a learner in hopes that then they're going to also engage in similar responses. If I engage in a power struggle of do this and then I hold the demand and I continue to do this, I'm I'm just digging myself into a really deep hole, right? I'm not engaging in a flexible enough response for that context. And I'm also establishing a pretty maladaptive behavior for myself as part of the educational or learning environment. So this is again why it's really important that we're aware of our own behavior as we practice ACT and recognizing that we have to be practicing this because we're modeling these behaviors, most to least prompting, right? As we're teaching these skills to our learners. All right, cool. So this is that first pillar, if you will, values and committed action. Okay, this next thing that I really like to talk about, because I honestly, y'all, so y'all are getting a better thing right now because I skipped this one in the live and I had to go back to it. So diffusion, what happens if you can't? What happens if you're like, I can't engage in a committed action? I'm struggling to tolerate this, much less accept this, which we're going to talk about here in a second. This is a struggle. Well, maybe you need to recognize that our thoughts are sometimes really unhelpful. And that's also one of the ways that Dr. Hayes frames these, the way to make choices is, okay, is this inner behavior or observable behavior for that matter helping me act in alignment with my values within this current context or not? Not is this good or bad? Is this feeling of sadness or anger good or bad? Should I avoid my anger and stifle it down? Well, no, because then I'm not going to engage in something that's good. I'm going to drown, right? Then I'm in an ocean that I'm like, crap, I'm not supposed to be in this ocean. I'm supposed to be in that one, right? But I jumped ship and I got into the wrong ocean essentially. So this is one of those things we've got to be paying attention to too. So diffusion gives us that separation between the challenge and our committed action. This gives us, as Matthews would say, the space between, right? We need the space between the challenge and our ability to move forward sometimes. And some ways that we can do this might be singing a song, whistling while we work, cursing, going on a quick walk, engaging in some physical activity that's fast and might be immediate, like a dance break or a shake it out break. Sometimes I'll do some quick sun salutations. Anything that might just kind of like, okay, add a little bit of separation. If you're having some really intrusive thoughts yourself, write them down. And then one of my favorite exercises is to actually take a roll of toilet paper, not a full roll, but some sheets, and write on there what's going on, and then flush it down the toilet because that's how much those thoughts matter. And that's what diffusion is really trying to teach us is that those thoughts aren't always helpful. And sometimes we need to flush them down the toilet so that we can get back to treading water possibly for a second before we re-engage in why am I in the ocean? And then we can find our surfboard again to ride that wave, right? And that's again what ACT is all about, is attempting to ride that wave. So another way that we can practice this, especially with our learners and when we're talking about the learning context, is self as context. This is perspective taking. And this is also one of the hardest parts for everyone. And I say this because it's hard for me, it's hard for my kids, it's hard for my staff. I've never known anybody who is like, yeah, I'm so good at taking somebody else's perspective. We're not. We're inherently pretty selfish. So, and as behavior analysts, we also don't like to do the introspection work. And that's what self as context really does call for us to do. So it asks that we take perspective taking. Maybe it asks that we take the perspective of our own inner child or our own self who's an elder. Or maybe it's asking that we take the perspective of our generation or generations before us. So we have to think about these things before we start practicing this with learners because we don't want to bring what is unhealed from our inner child into a session with a kiddo. Because this is often what happens is that we haven't accounted for our inner child or our inner elder or the generational trauma that we're carrying. And we bring this into a learning context. And we see a learner who's in a challenging situation. And instead of being able to take their perspective, we bring our inner child's perspective. How well has that worked out for us in the past? Right? We don't need to bring in the way that our caregivers raised us into the session with our kids and our learners, but we do this all the time. So, this is why it's important that we engage in this perspective taking and practice it before we put ourselves in a situation where we could potentially be bringing some of our own baggage into the room. Um, Something else with self as context is just noticing I'm having the feeling that I'm angry, right? I'm not angry. I'm Meg, right? But I'm having the feeling that I'm angry. Right? I can't tell because I'm silent. I'm having the feeling that I'm angry, right? This is also where it's very important that we teach our learners how to identify emotions and respond to those emotions as they happen and occur contextually. So what I mean by that is if you are holding up a 2D picture of somebody and say, "How's this person feeling?" They don't know. And I will tell you they don't know because there's a ton of research to support that they don't know. And I'm happy to share it with you offline. Just send me an email and I will get those research articles to you. But what essentially we know is that unless somebody knows the context of why this person is demonstrating whatever facial expression they are, we don't know. We have to know the context. And so, what I encourage you to do is while you're teaching emotions, how to receptively identify and tact emotions, do it in a video example that has some context so that then that learner can identify contextually what type of emotion they might be feeling. Does that make sense? You can also do this yourself by identifying like, ooh, like sometimes like this has happened. Let's say somebody's like just walked into a session and you get caught off guard and you get startled. Identify that. Oh man, my shoulders went up and I got startled. I felt startled. Identify that feeling. Oh man, I don't want to do this. It's making me feel really frustrated. I'm noticing that my eyebrows are really furrowed right now, right? Label it for yourself so that then it's easier for then you to help prompt your learner during this self as context noticing time of, ooh, I noticed that when I presented this worksheet, you immediately clenched your jaw. Could this be kind of frustrating? Right? So also what that does is immediately give us in our flow chart a different way that we're probably going to be responding, right? Rather than just the SD of do the worksheet, right? Or reducing the response effort, whatever it might be. Like, man, we just immediately added some validation. That perspective taking was all that that learner needed to move forward. It happens all the time. So we already demonstrated how beneficial, in my opinion, engaging in present moment awareness can be. But I want us to think about that again too, whenever, let's say we've presented that worksheet and validating that this could be frustrating wasn't enough. Okay, that's frustrating for me. So what am I going to do? I've got to get myself out from my perfectionist ideas of how this was supposed to look and get into what it actually looks like. So that's why I've got to get back into the present moment. I find that that's one of the things that we have to do the most often is just get back into it, right? So it's going to be important that we model that really readily and fluently for our learners. We're going to come right back to that exercise because I want to talk about this piece because we just talked about diffusion. We talked about self as context, and we talked about present moment awareness. Before that, we talked about our values and our committed action. So acceptance is the last of the six pillars for us to discuss. And what I want to say is if you aren't doing skills-based treatment with those high magnitude behaviors, I suggest that you start. And that's because when we talk about scope and sequence, right? Like we were talking about earlier, this is part of it, right? So this is one of the ways that we can establish that here's where we are before this flow chart begins, before we have to start this flexible responding. And the reason I say this is because SBT gives learners a way to communicate, a way for that communication to be reinforced and honored and validated so that trust can be established. And then again, it's going to give another communication response that's tolerance. Okay, this is the first step of acceptance. So again, when we're looking at relational frame theory, okay, that's the first step of being able to say, like, okay, I can do hard things, right? That's that first step of that inner behavior. Okay, I can do that. Okay, no problem. Okay, but I'm going to need some help. Okay, the tolerance response is the bridge to our acceptance response, okay? So acceptance is verbalizing the agreement. Yeah, I'm ready for this, right? I can do this. I can face this challenge. It's labeling, yeah, okay, here we are. It's owning that action. It's demonstrating assent. That's what it is. So again, highly encourage y'all to incorporate SBT in your practices. But if you haven't, girl, y'all start. It's a great time to start. Um, okay, so again, if you've got any questions about what I mean by this, but tolerance versus acceptance, please let me know. But acceptance is, all right, I can do this. It is accepting, yeah, that person lied. That was really kind of crappy, but okay, I don't have to lie. That's also acceptance, right? Now I can engage in a value-based behavior. Or, man, I'm still kind of struggling with that. Maybe I need to write these thoughts down and burn them or flush them down the toilet or whatever it might be to practice some diffusion. Or maybe I need to write a silly song about this. I love to do that. That's actually one of my husband's and my favorite ways to practice diffusion is to sing silly songs about whatever it is that's going on. It's a great way to practice it. We do dance parties with our kids because that's another way to practice it. I will tell my kids that I will give them purple nurples. Jokes are a great way to practice diffusion. So again, like just think about these kind of ways that are meaningful to you, meaningful to your learners that you can practice. Okay, so I wanted to go into this practice speaking of right now. This is a timing. I love precision teaching. The reason I love precision teaching is because I like to chart my own behavior and then make decisions based on that and observations. So, some of the things that I've learned with charting my own behavior, in particular with charting my behavior when it comes to practicing ACT skills, is that I notice that when I am not practicing these skills, that I have increased stress responses. But when I do practice these skills, I have fewer stress responses. Perfect example would be this evening. As I mentioned earlier, this was a live version, but the recording was nowhere to be found. So I was like, okay, there was a glitch with our system because it was supposed to record to the cloud, but there was another file, I guess, that was trying to download. And so it never happened. So I did get angry, right? Because it's frustrating. So I guess I felt more frustrated. So I felt really frustrated. I had the feeling that I was frustrated because, man, I'd already done an hour and actually 10 minutes of work. So I'd already talked for an hour and 10 minutes about ACT. Do I have to do this again? There's my diffusion. I cursed a little bit. And then I looked at my husband and I said, I have to re-record this. And he said, okay. So I looked at my kids and I said, I'm always going to go upstairs. Please let me record this. Okay. right? They also were engaging in their acceptance and tolerance responses. But that's what I had to do. I could have avoided this and been like, sorry, there wasn't a recording. Guess we'll get to it whenever we can. No, because that's not in alignment with my values, which is learning and disseminating. That's another one of my values, just FYI. And I guess I could have just been like, oh, something happened in the recording. Sorry, y'all. But that's not honest, right? Also against one of my values. So I guess I just have to accept the fact that I'm re-recording it. That's where we are. All right, let's move forward then, right? Let's take some committed action. And y'all are witnessing values-based action. Okay, so this timing here with precision teaching, because again, we notice that when we're charting our behaviors, like sometimes we engage in stress responses and sometimes we don't. But because I had already practiced some ACT today, I was able to engage in a committed action and not continue to spiral in a horrible bad mood and be like, well, I didn't record it, right? That's what can happen to us often. So my hope is right now we're going to give ourselves a little bit of baseline data. So grab your piece of paper, scratch notebook, whatever, pen, pencil, whatever you have. Take a minute. You can pause it. It's recording, right? So pause it to gather your things. And then when you do, come back and you're going to put 6 boxes on your paper, large enough to be able to write in the boxes. At the top of each of the boxes, you're going to write one of the 6 core processes that we just talked about: values, committed action, present moment, self as context, diffusion, and acceptance. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to set a timer for 1 minute, right? 1 minute timing. And in each of those boxes, you're going to write one or more things. You're going to start with one of something that you truly care about, right? For your values. Or for committed actions, it might be, what did you do that was in alignment with your values today? What behavior did you engage in? For self as context, like, well, what perspective may you have taken today? For the present moment, maybe engage in like, what can you observe right now in this exact moment? For diffusion, well, what was maybe a way that you released some of the stress that you're feeling right now, or released an unhelpful thought? Or what are some ways that you can in the future? And maybe what is something that you either accepted or are struggling to accept or would like to accept? And then if any of these are kind of a struggle, think about maybe what you would want for yourself. What perspective might be helpful? What present moment observation might be helpful? What value would you like to explore more? So this is what I'm going to encourage y'all to do. Again, I'm going to set a 1 minute timer. It's an honor system here because it's a recording, so I won't really know if you did it or not. But I'm going to trust that you will because it's important to practice the things that we preach. It's important to practice these things and these skills if we're expecting others to do it, especially if we're expecting children to do it. So go ahead. I'm going to get my timer going. And when I say write, you're going to fill in the blanks and write. Halfway there. Okay, just a few more seconds left. Okay, our time is up. So as I mentioned earlier, this is a baseline assessment. You've just completed a baseline assessment for yourself when it comes to ACT. And the reason I say this is because there were obviously some places that were probably a little bit more of a struggle. Those are areas where you need to focus a little bit more. Give yourself some more tools and some more skills in those areas. Some things that came up during our live version were that it was really difficult to come up with areas where for self as context, perspective taking. So one of the examples was that it's really difficult to engage in the perspective taking for my inner child. That's valid. And I would say that if you have some of these things that are arising, it's really important to work with a professional therapist or a licensed counselor because they can usually help work through some of these feelings that you might be having that might be in conflict with your inner child or generational trauma or things along those lines that can be more specific to you to help develop this tool or these tools and the skill set for you so that again you are a more well-rounded practitioner who's able to practice self-compassion and therefore practice compassion towards others. So I hope that makes sense with what I'm trying to say. But it's really important that we recognize, like, oh man, this is hard. This isn't always easy. And sometimes we just kind of bark coping skills at our learners and expect them to stop stop, drop, and breathe. And it just doesn't work, right? So be aware of that and be aware of how difficult that exercise alone might have been. So I think just to kind of summarize this, where do you start? Well, you got to start with you. If you are going to write a behavior intervention plan for your learners, you probably have one, you need to have one in place for yourself as well. That means that you're going to have a plan of action for when your inner child shows up to the session or to the classroom. You are going to have a course of action whenever your anger takes over because you are in conflict with whatever value it might be. These are the things that we have to be aware of is that our behavior will in fact affect this learner's behavior. So if we're modeling the skills that we want to see, we're also then going to be teaching those skills that we want to see as well. Cool. Um, you're gonna you're gonna fall. You're gonna start drowning. You're gonna start treading water. You're gonna yell. You're gonna lose it, just as your learners do. You have to be able to make the commitment to get back on it so that you can model what that looks like so that then we can get our learners back into it as well. But again, like we think about this all the time, like people want to be like, well, that doesn't work. It didn't work. That intervention didn't work. Well, okay. Are you going to try something else? Are you going to try again? Or are we just going to give up on trying anything? Because that's sometimes what ends up happening, right? So just keep on, keep practicing and recognize that you can go months without trying, years without practicing, and then one day wake up and make the choice to try again. Your flow chart started back up again, and now you're making choices. It's the same for our learners. And I don't think I can emphasize this enough. You got to model it. Everything that we do has to be modeled. Model diffusion, model noticing, model observing, model saying all of this. Be so narrative in your sessions and your school day and your throughout your day that it's impossible to not notice these things. Because what you'll find is that then your learners will catch on to what you're noticing, and then they're going to be more aware of those behaviors and emotions that align with those different contexts. Then you're going to have some more data, right? Okay, so why is this important? It always comes back to trauma. So recently there was an article that came out. It was at the beginning of December or late November, and I'm going to upload it because it's on my to-do list and somebody's already reminded me. But adolescents have reported there over two-thirds of adolescents have reported experiencing at least four adverse childhood events. And I take that back. It's 76%. So three quarters. Significant. That is significant. And at least one, right? And then there's about a third who've reported at least four, having experienced at least four. And what I will say is that if our children have experienced these adverse events, that their caregivers have also experienced these childhood events or these childhood adverse events, if not more. So I have this example, which is the ACEs for adults. And I encourage y'all to go to acesware.org and download this. It's free, it's on their website. and score yourself. Take your data, right? Take another assessment tool. You've got one assessment tool that you've already done. You've got some baseline for your psychological flexibility, essentially. Now take some baseline on your trauma. What is your ACEs score? That number is important. Those events are important, and those events are part of your learning history that you're bringing to the learning environment. So, this is also important because from a behavior analytic lens, Dr. Camille Kolu has identified a great framework that aligns with the work that Dr. Nadine Burke Harris has done, and it is to align our six buffers. Of those six buffers, one of them is readily ready, excuse me, access to coping skills or the use of coping skills. ACT provides that for us. It gives us those coping skills. So the others are nutrition, right? Committed physical activity, relationships, sleep. Did I already say nutrition? Oh no, mental health. So practicing work with a therapist, like we were talking about earlier, if the inner child showing up, you might need to talk to somebody about that, right? Might need to process that. And then, of course, like these coping skills. Am I able to diffuse? Am I able to engage in the present moment? Okay. If my buffers are being accounted for, and if I can account for my learners' buffers, and I can account for some of the buffers for the caregivers, the chances of me causing harm are going to be mitigated. And that's because I've accounted for more than just the setting events, but I'm also providing tools to help navigate challenges rather than trying to push through challenges or avoid them. Okay. So again, but this is wrapping up. Our last learning objective here is, what does our literature say? How is this actually applicable? This is pretty applicable right now in our holiday season, self-care and stress management. Tons of research to support how acceptance and commitment therapy can help us in stressful situations. One of my favorites is actually from the World Health Organization. It's an entire booklet that talks about how ACT is essentially the best way to deal with stress. So, talk about toxic stress right here. This is toxic stress. If the World Health Organization says, hey, if you're experiencing some stress, ACT is the way to go. You might want to listen to them. I don't know. Um, but if it's applicable for us, is anybody who's engaging in stress, let's think about what it might be like for other neurodivergent learners. And I say other because anxiety and anxiety disorders, that's part of it's under the umbrella of neurodivergence, right? Chronic diseases, caregiver support. And I think I didn't mention this article, but I know it's in our references. And I know it's not an article, I apologize, it's a book. For caregiver support, Doctors Coyne and Whittingham have an incredible resource for acceptance and commitment therapy for supporting caregivers. And I highly encourage you to read that. It gives some great perspectives and it really helps talk about how this is applicable with neurodivergent children within the home. Interpersonal skills, so like those social skills, soft skills, OBM, avoidance, and clinical practices. So, Dr. Tarbach or Dr. Dixon actually has the AIM curriculum, which provides a really great framework for metaphors to essentially guide sessions whenever you're introducing ACT. This is what I would suggest though with that. Make it meaningful for the learner. Only do what's meaningful for the learner. Discover where those baseline holes are, and pinpoint those tools for a while before you start working in some of the other ones. Use the other ones as behavioral momentum, if you will. So, like if you notice that the learner is really great at engaging in I Spy as part of their like present moment awareness, great. Use that, maybe that kind of like go-to, that first prompt. But then if they're still kind of hooked, right? They're still kind of in like this kind of like negative assent withdrawal state, you might then also look at prompting in another way, like, oh man, I would also feel really frustrated if this is what we were doing, right? So engaging in that self as context piece. And then you're going to go through that flow chart, right? This happened, this didn't happen. Now I'm going to do this, now I'm going to do that. That's why it's important that we're working on this. But the AIM curriculum is a great framework to use. Just make choices based on that flow chart and what the context is needing. This is just a great takeaway, I think. Just remember this. You're not going to be able to tell somebody to calm down. You're not going to be able to use your SD voice in this. You're not going to be able to tell somebody to take three deep breaths and then they'll get access to their iPad. This is not what ACT is. It is literally like, oh, I told him to, I said, hey, do you want to take some breaths? Mm-mm. Okay, well, I'm going to try something else then, okay? Rather than like barking this demand at somebody and expecting them to regulate. So, for me, I find that ACT is amazing at demonstrating assent behaviors because, okay, verbal recognition. Okay, got this. I'm ready. I've got my social skills, right? Because I'm going to do some perspective taking of like, ooh, that person probably doesn't want to talk about goldfish. Weird. Okay, well, let me think about something else that we can talk about. Or values-based exercises like, oh man, I actually recognize that maybe I don't want to be friends with that person because their values are not in alignment with mine, right? I need to find somebody who can help develop a stronger relationship and a better connection. The idea and the nature of psychological flexibility, because it's RFT, is that it's contextual. Things that are taught contextually, as opposed to, again, like stepwise, are naturally going to generalize more because you are teaching directly to that context as opposed to simply the function or the topography of the behavior. And then I also find that there's so much research with ACT to support with caregiver training and caregiver support that it really does provide a way to give empathetic and compassionate resources. I encourage motivational interviewing whenever you're helping with this rather than just saying, like, oh, well, you just got to ride the wave. I know that you're drowning this holiday season. Ride the wave, find your surfboard. That's what I learned. That's I get that that's what I said, but that's not what I meant whenever I'm talking about caregivers. I mean, maybe say like, man, it is a really hard season, isn't it? It's busy. Don't tell them your problems with your dog, by all means, please. But then just say, you know, I'm here to help you. I know that sometimes the holiday season can be hard. Are there ways that I can help you reconnect with what you want for you and your family this season? That is a question that instead of saying, like, what do you value? Because that people might not know what they value, but they might know what they want to connect with their family. Well, you know what I love? I love whenever we can decorate cookies for Christmas, but I haven't had time to do that. Oh, I have an idea. What if I put together a task analysis for like cookie baking and decorating, and we can do that for like your engagement program this week? What do you think? Could we do that for an hour of our session? Yeah, that could work. And you know what? I actually think I could go ahead and get the cookies made if y'all just want to do this, right? Cool. Let's do that. Let's get y'all connected together as a family because I recognize that's something that you value, right? And then you can label it. And then again, I have found, and this came up in the live, which was buy-in. You don't need buy-in if it's socially valid. Because you're going to focus everything around the learner and around your values, it's going to be naturally person-centered, which means that it's naturally going to be socially valid. So recognize that. ACT is inherently socially valid because you can't tell somebody what metaphor is going to work for them. You can't tell somebody what response or behavior is going to be helpful for them in that context. You can only guide them to these choices that they can make. And then you can respond based on the behavior that they've demonstrated, right? That's life. This is another example of what we did earlier, but in a more visual form. So I call this the Hexaflex. So for this, we've got a kiddo who has some severe eczema. So the problem is my hand hurts, right? And I'm avoiding washing my hands because every time that I wash my hands, it hurts more. So what are some things that I value? I love doing art with my grandma, but I also get my hands really dirty and then I have to wash my hands, and so it makes me mad, right? That's a legit thing that happens. So, what are some committed actions that I can do so that I can keep doing art with my grandma? Because I have to wash my hands. I can have lotion. I can use a soft towel and I can use medicated ointments or cortisone cream or something like that that's prescribed by my doctor or that might be more in line with eczema, like nourishing. Well, what can I say to myself? Well, I can say to myself that my hands are really strong and they're really creative, and I can do these things even when my hands do hurt and even after I've washed my hands. And I can also recognize that I really like it when my hands do feel soft. And sometimes that's one of my things that I'm struggling with because I'm struggling with this perspective of wanting to do these art projects and also wanting to keep my hands soft. So I can shift this perspective a little bit for what I might need in this moment. And then maybe something that I can engage in whenever I'm washing my hands is I can play around with the water temperature so that it's warm or it's cold. I can smell the soap. I can blow bubbles. These are things that I can do to engage in the present moment to help me stay focused with washing my hands. And then if it's really hard for me, I might sing a silly song while I'm washing my hands. I might make up something silly about washing my hands. And I'm, again, might blow some more bubbles. I might see how many bubbles I can make when I clap my hands together. And I can also tell myself when I'm struggling to accept these things that I know that lotion will help. And I know that it still hurts and it's okay because I can put on lotion to help myself feel better, right? So, this is again just an example of how this kind of visual practice of ACT can come into play with a learner who has some experiential avoidance for a medical need, such as having eczema and still needing to wash their hands. Cool. So, some other ways that we can use that we can collect data, timings, like we did before. This equal sign, I apologize, is supposed to be a plus. So you can just do yes, no responding. And what I would encourage you to do is every time that you see a no, then maybe write down what the next option was that was presented to then see was that accepted or was that also denied. Gives you some really great data to know what works and what doesn't, what might work and what might not, right? And what you might want to try, what has a high probability rate. It's just giving you your some more robust data for your analysis. It might be engaging in a committed action of um, engaging in a reciprocal conversation and you can collect the data or engaging in sibling interaction or decorating cookies with their caregivers, right? So you can record the duration of these activities. I love self-monitoring, and again, because I love precision teaching, I love to teach s- charting with my learners. So my learners might score their own behaviors and their own timings as they align with ACT. And then, of course, you can also do like, what's the latency? So, like, let's say you presented a choice, but they haven't chosen anything yet. So, you just need to record how long it takes them to before they make a choice. That can give you some data, right? Because then you're going to understand, like, where do we need to start with fluency here? Cool. This is another example. So, these are two other visuals of hexaflexes or matrix, a visual representation of psychological flexibility. One of these is from an actual client, another is just an example, but they both demonstrate this is what happens. These are the thoughts, these are the difficulties, these are the challenges in the center, right? Then here's what I value. Here are the actions that I can take within this particular context that are in alignment with my values. Here's what I'm struggling with perspective taking within this particular context. Here's what I can do to engage in the present moment whenever this is really bothering me. And if I'm struggling to separate and find some separation from this, like I can practice some diffusion. I can find some space by doing a dance party, shaking it out, um, flipping my hair, favorite. Um, I can then practice acceptance by saying, like, okay, well, some people might not like me. Okay, it's hard. I can say this is hard. And now I can move forward, right? And then this is something that each of y'all have as part of the access to the recording, which are these two data sheets. So one is again a self data sheet, so a self-scoring for the learner, which is the student daily sheet. Today, I felt best when and then have them list those activities that they were doing. That's going to help us get some baseline of like, okay, what's meaningful to them? And then maybe some things that might be an area of struggle. Um, how do they practice within their values? And then score that alongside them so that there's some IOA. And then also, I have this set up for a timing essentially. So, or for precision teaching. So, like average aim, which is like, what's your average target? So, like, let's say that you want them to demonstrate a values-based activity or committed action 3 times in an hour. I would put 3 times per hour in that average aim. And then in my total time, I would say 1 hour, right? So 3 times 1 hour. And then I would score what actually happened. And you can choose to do all of those, or you can choose to do just one of them. It's up to you, right? If you want to just do committed action for the day, just score committed action. That's fine. If you want to present a metaphor for diffusion or acceptance, great. Just score that. That's fine. It gives you data. It's still meaningful. Okay, cool. All right. So this is where we end, folks. Again, I'm always happy to help y'all. Um, Most of the articles that are going to be most relative to what you're needing are going to be accessible in where you access the recording here. Um, but all of these references are available under our free resources, which is also on our Podia CEU website, same place where you purchased this CEU recording. So just scroll through those products, you'll find resources. It's zero. There's no cost, but there are several hundred articles in there and resources that I have found to be helpful. And I hope that you find them helpful too. All right. Wonderful, everyone. Again, thanks so much. If you've got any questions, I'm happy to help y'all. Just email me, meg@acrossenvironments.com. We also, for upcoming things in 2025, we're going to be doing a year-long series on how we incorporate ACT into practices. So I really encourage y'all to look into that if this is something that was of interest to you. And then if you're looking to expand that even further, because I know I talked a little bit about SBT, I also talked about precision teaching. So some of the ways that we practice compassionate care is with this kind of like holistic package approach. So some colleagues of mine and I Madi Lucy Serra and Jennifer Ferris, and I've written a textbook called Reframe. And if you're interested, again, email me for some more information, and I'm happy to provide that with you. It'll be released in early spring of 2025, but we're very excited about that because, again, it provides a framework as opposed to this is how you have to do it. And that's how I encourage most people to practice. All right. Happy learning, everyone. Thanks so much.